Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Now that the monsoon session of Parliament is underway and the country is preparing to celebrate 75 years of independence, there's a critical question we ask today. How effectively is our Parliament functioning? Is it living up to our expectations or is it letting us down? That's the key issue I shall explore today with the Head of Legislative and Civic Engagement at PRS Legislative Research, Chakshu Roy. Chakshu Roy, let's start with the Lok Sabha. The 16th Lok Sabha, which is the last full Lok Sabha, worked for a total of 1,615 hours, which is 40% lower than the average for a full-term Lok Sabha. In fact, when I look at your website, I see that in the 50s and 60s, there were some Lok Sabhas that averaged pretty close to 4,000 hours. So is it the case that over the decades, the amount of time the Lok Sabha spends working has been steadily and sometimes sharply decreasing?
Mr. Thapar, if we look at a parliamentary democracy, there are two or three distinct stages that have happened in the evolution of a parliamentary system. We started out in 52. For the first 10-15 years, things went relatively well, and Parliament used to average anywhere between 100 and 120 days a year. And when Parliament was working for that long, there was a lot of time that members of Parliament could spend in the House debating on issues. Post the 67 general elections, there was that much more competitive parliamentary debating that started happening. Then there was the emergency. Then we had an era of parliaments where there were large single party majorities, just like at the time of independence. 90s saw another era of coalition governments. Now, during all of these distinct phases, the time that Parliament used to meet every year started declining. But we should also look as to why that happens. Now, the way our constitution is structured, Parliament does not convene itself. Right? For example, today you and I discussed on a particular time to meet and we stuck to that time schedule. Parliament does not have a fixed calendar as to when it is going to meet, unlike the UK, where Parliament meets for the entire year. In the US, Parliament meets for, the US Congress meets for 100 to 150 days a year. Our Parliament is dictated by the fact as to when government decides that Parliament should meet. And that creates an interesting problem. And the problem is that our constitution gives Parliament that authority to act as a check on the functioning of the government. And the government decides as to when Parliament will meet to exercise that function. So successive governments over the years have steadily ensured that Parliament is convened for lesser and lesser number of days.
So the point I made is true, that if you look at the trajectory of Parliament from 47 till now, over the last 75 years, successive governments have called Parliament for a shorter and shorter duration, as a result of which the amount of time the Lok Sabha actually is sitting and working has been steadily and sometimes sharply diminishing, which is why The 16th Lok Sabha, which you say is the last full Lok Sabha, actually worked for 40% lower time than the average of all other full Lok Sabhas. It's a sharp decline.
It is a decline, and in the last 3 decades, there have been 2 more reasons that have contributed towards how Parliament has functioned. One is more parliamentary. So, in the early 90s, Parliament decided that it will institute parliamentary committees. And what these committees did was they took some of the load of Parliament's discussion away from the floor of the House into the committee room, so more nuanced discussions could happen. The second reason is more political. A lot of campaigning elements entered into our parliamentary discourse, into our governance, and what that meant was that political parties on the floor of the House were engaged in disrupting parliamentary proceedings that much more. That further brought down the time that Parliament had available to debate.
So on the one hand, select committees began functioning, and a lot of the work of Parliament happened outside the floor of the House in select committees, which is one explanation for the fact that Parliament didn't meet for as long as it used to do previously. And the other explanation is that in fact disruptions meant that a lot of time was wasted, and governments chose rather than let Parliament carry on being disrupted to shorten the session. But the truth of the matter is the point that you made in the middle of your first answer. Because one of the functions of Parliament is to keep a check on the functioning of government and to make it accountable, governments shorten the duration of Parliament because they don't like being made accountable, they don't like being checked upon.
And this is a phenomena which is true not only at Parliament, at the national level. If you look at the state legislative assembly,
it's even worse.
It's even worse.
I'll come to the states in a moment's time, but before I come to the states, let's speak a little bit more about the 2 key functions of the Lok Sabha. One of them is passing bills. Now, in the 15th Lok Sabha, 26% of bills, according to PRS Research, were actually passed within 36 minutes. In the 16th Lok Sabha, that figure is improved, it's now only 6%, but what has happened in the 16th Lok Sabha is that the number of bills that are sent to committees for scrutiny is down to just 25% compared to 71% and 61% in the previous 2 Lok Sabhas. So my first question about the functioning of Parliament is a simple one. Is enough scrutiny being given to legislation? Is Parliament discussing it? Is it understanding it? Is it raising questions? Or are bills being pushed through without adequate debate and discussion?
So I have a slightly long-winded answer, but I hope you'll bear with me. Now, let's talk about the fact as to why laws are important in this country. They shape our society, they regulate our lives, and when a law is made by Parliament, it will stay relevant for the country for a very long time. The other thing that will happen is that it's not going to impact a handful of people. It will impact everybody in the country. So which means that when our Parliament makes laws, it cannot or should not make a law which is suboptimal. It should not make a law which will not work, if not 100%, not even 90% when it is made. Because the opportunity cost of a law which is badly made is extremely high for a country of our size.
And what you're suggesting is that if those laws are not properly scrutinized, debated and questioned, if the clauses are not thought about carefully, then the law will be suboptimal, it will need to be revised and reviewed several times, and Parliament is therefore wasting its time, and the law that's being made is imperfect and not the right one for the country.
Yeah. So, what I'm arguing is the laws that Parliament makes are so important that each one of them should be scrutinized thoroughly by Parliament, no matter how big or small it is.
But is that happening?
So that currently is not happening. That scrutiny in some legislation is good, in some legislation it's mediocre, and in some legislation it's not there at all. Now, how do we as a country are allowing for laws to be made which have different degrees of scrutiny? And that's where deliberations in Parliament come place. You mentioned that there are many laws that haven't gone to a parliamentary committee. Now let's look at as to how debate happens. Debate on the floor of the House is more the cut and thrust of political argument. It is ideological.
It's repartee.
It's repartee too.
It's thrust and parry.
Thrust and parry. But outside of that, laws are also technical things. Laws are also nuanced. So you need to sit in a room where there are no cameras, where party ideologies are lowered a little bit, so that you can discuss the technical nuance.
And if only 25% of legislation is going to committees to be scrutinized in this careful, considered manner, then again 75% of legislation ipso facto is actually not being scrutinized carefully. I mean, what this means, that the functioning of Parliament in terms of scrutinizing legislation is being done, let me put it mildly, improperly.
Yes. So what it means is that the laws that are getting made by Parliament, and not only this Parliament, successive Parliaments, are not scrutinized at a base level as any other law. Right? So to give you an example, when a bill goes to a parliamentary committee, so let's say if there was a bill that was going to regulate media, and you as an expert would want to share your insights after having worked in the space for so long, a parliamentary committee would allow you that space. Right? So you would be able to go and inform the committee about what you thought about that particular piece of legislation.
That is rarely possible in India, because parliamentary committees don't get more than 25% of legislation.
Yeah.
So let's agree on this. If one of the important functions of Parliament is the scrutiny of legislation, it's happening improperly, imperfectly, and inadequately.
Yes. I would also want to put it that way, that it is an opportunity where our Parliament could really scale up in the way it functions when it comes to analyzing and scrutinizing.
That's what Parliament should do, but it shows no sign of wanting to do it. Parliament as a whole, with the exception of a few individual voices, is quite happy to carry on functioning imperfectly, improperly, and inadequately as far as the scrutiny of legislation is concerned. Let's come to the second big important function of the Lok Sabha, which is to hold the government to account. You mentioned it earlier, governments don't like being held to account, which is why they don't summon Parliament for very long. But the truth is that if you look at the last 4 Lok Sabhas, question time has actually functioned for only roughly 59% of its scheduled time in the Lok Sabha, and in the Rajya Sabha it's even lower at 41%, which means an opportunity to hold the government to account is being squandered and wasted.
Question time is a very exciting time of Parliament. Members of Parliament have used this opportunity to ask probing questions of governments, and sometimes these questions have led to discoveries about government malfeasance, and it is one of the most powerful instruments that Parliament has in holding government to account.
Which is why it's such a shame that only 59% of question time actually over the last 4 Lok Sabhas, not one Lok Sabha but last 4, is actually being utilized, and 41% in the case of the Rajya Sabha. So it's a very useful device, but it's not being used to hold the government to account.
It's a very useful device, and possibly a device that requires that much more strengthening. Now, one of the things that political parties have started doing is that question time, because of the fact as to it is so newsworthy, is also a time when political parties think that is the best time to disrupt House proceedings.
Quite right. Political parties end up playing to the gallery and thus further undermining the utility of question time. But the point I'm making is this: just as Parliament is imperfect and inadequate in fulfilling its first function of scrutinizing legislation, Parliament is equally imperfect and inadequate in fulfilling its second role, which is holding the government to account. In fact, even the time allotted is not fully used for that purpose. It's often disrupted instead by MPs who choose to play to the gallery. But there's one other reason which has begun to come up pretty frequently during the last 8 years why governments can't be held properly to account. They don't allow discussion to happen on critical issues that they know will be adverse to their interests. For example, 26 months have gone by since the Chinese aggression in Ladakh, and it hasn't been discussed in any House of Parliament, neither the Lok Sabha nor the Rajya Sabha, which is contrary to how Parliament treated the India-China war in 1962, when during the war itself, Parliament was debating the issue. What can one do when the government won't allow Parliament to discuss the subject, even though it's absolutely in the national interest the subject be discussed?
It's interesting as to how parliamentary discourse takes place, how agenda is set for Parliament, about what issues Parliament will discuss and what issues Parliament will not discuss. Now, our parliamentary rules are fairly archaic. They were made in 1952, and when they were made, the rules were designed to allow the government business to have primacy. So, if the government wants to pass a bill, that takes priority. If the government wants to pass a budget, that takes priority. And over the years, that space for opposition parties to raise issues that they felt
Has diminished.
has diminished. Now, this is not a phenomena which is only there in India. It extends in all parliaments.
Can I interrupt here? When John Bercow was the Speaker of the House of Commons, there were several instances when Boris Johnson did not want subjects debated. He did not want time allocated for the debate, but the Speaker did so because he believed the issue was important, and secondly, because there was a sufficient number of opposition MPs demanding that it be raised. Why can't our Speaker step in similarly and say, this is a national parliament, the issue is of importance to the country, it has to be discussed, the government has to agree?
Yeah.
Why can't he step in and do that?
So, it's interesting that you mentioned the House of Commons. Now, what the House of Commons has going for it is that the House of Commons rules of procedure, in let's say in 100 days of functioning in a year, allow for 20 days for the opposition to decide the agenda about what will be debated on the floor of the House.
There's no such facility in India.
There is no such facility in India. Now, the Speaker in all parliaments is an arbiter of the House. The Speaker, using his authority, can convince political parties to come together, but the Speaker cannot decide the agenda of the House. Now, one of the things that has started happening in our parliamentary system is that the opposition parties and the ruling parties sometimes cannot agree on what subjects to be debated.
This is where the Speaker's arbitration becomes critical, and this is where the nature and quality of the Speaker becomes paramount. Let's then come to the Speaker. Are our Speakers, I'm not talking about any individual, but are our Speakers as a whole impartial, neutral, independent and objective as they are required to be, or do they find subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways of actually leaning in full support of the party they once belonged to or still belong to?
I think the real question to be asked there is not individual judgment of the speakers, but have we designed enough of our systems to ensure that no matter who assumes the speaker's chair is able to act impartially?
In other words, that capacity for the Speaker to act impartially does not exist in India.
Yeah. So, the reason where I disagree from you is that should it be dependent on the individual who will occupy the chair, or should the rules be designed in such a way or conventions be designed in such a way that even if an individual who was a pure party man till the time they were elected speaker, when they become speaker, they become this non-partisan
I accept
affair.
your point. Let me ask you two further questions connected to the issue of the Speaker. First of all, is it a travesty of Parliament that the Chinese aggression for 26 months has not been discussed? That the Speaker did not use his powers to persuade, to cajole, to push the government into making time for this debate? Is it a travesty of Parliament? Because clearly, Parliament has a duty to discuss aggression on Indian soil, and it hasn't done so. So, answer that question. Is it a travesty of our Parliament? Is it an indictment of our Parliament that this issue has not been discussed?
I think it is an indictment of a parliament that issues around China, issues around our farm laws, issues around territorial aggressions, issues around our neighbors with our neighbors are not getting enough space on the floor of the House.
In the case of China, no space at all.
Yes, but the way Parliament functions is, are we looking at installing blame on the institution, or are we looking at as to what is it that the institution could have done to ensure that these debates have
we're not installing blame on anyone. We're examining and analyzing the functioning of the institution, and in examining the functioning of the institution, you've helped us establish two things. Two of the prime functions of the Lok Sabha, the scrutiny of legislation and the holding of government to account, is not being performed adequately or perfectly. In fact, it's being performed pretty inadequately in the case of scrutiny, and is hardly being performed at all in the case of holding the government to account. Let me then ask, would an adoption of a British convention give us, as Speaker, a better system within which to operate? As you know, in Britain, when an individual becomes a Speaker, he or she immediately resigns from his or her party. And secondly, if the individual chooses to stand for re-election, the Speaker, the sitting Speaker, is not opposed. As a result of which, the umbilical link between the Speaker and his or her party is broken, and you can expect, and you often get, impartiality. Do we need to adopt that convention in India? Would it give our system of speakers a greater capacity to ensure fair play?
I think that will be one of the things that can be done.
What are the others?
A few of the other things that we need to do to ensure that Parliament is a forum for reasoned debate on national issues regularly is step one, change the rules of Parliament completely. Allow for Parliament not only to be an arena for discussion for government business, but for discussion on a range of issues which currently sometimes governments are reluctant to debate on the floor.
This is where giving primacy to the government's agenda would have to be rethought through.
Rethought through. So
what's the second?
So for example...
Don't give me examples, come to the second.
Okay. The second part is, if you take care of the rules first, the second part that you have to do is that you have to give members of Parliament independence to debate on issues.
This is where we come to the anti-defection law, which I'll come to in a moment's time because you've written extensively about it. Let's park that thought for now. Let's come instead to the situation in the states. If the situation in our national parliament is one that causes disturbance and despair because it's simply not functioning as we expect it to function, in the states, your PRS research suggests the situation is even worse. Last year, apparently they only averaged 21 days in the year as a whole, state assemblies. And in 2020, nearly half the bills passed by state assemblies were cleared on the very day that they were introduced. Now, to me, that suggests the state assemblies are not functioning, they're not scrutinizing legislation, they're certainly not holding state governments to account. Instead, state assemblies have become a sort of rubber stamp used by state governments to get their way.
It is unfortunate as to how state assemblies are currently functioning in the country. You quoted some statistics. Let me go a step further. There are occasions that when in state assemblies bills are passed depending on how quickly people can speak. So if the name of a bill is shorter, the bill could be passed in 3 minutes because it was just
3 minutes.
In 3 minutes.
So you're not joking, you really mean 3 minutes?
Yes. So there are occasions where state legislatures will pass 10 laws in an hour. Right? Now,
but this is a joke.
It is a joke. Now, what is applicable to Parliament, where Parliament still has committees and Parliament still has deliberation, at the state level, this deliberation is almost non-existent.
So I'm right in saying that state assemblies have effectively become a rubber stamp so that state governments can have their way.
Yes.
Let's come back to the national parliament. I deliberately deviated to talk about state assembly simply to point out that if the situation in our national parliament is despairing and disturbing, the situation at the state level is considerably worse. But let's come back to the national parliament. The Prime Minister, in a sense, is a very special person in the Indian system. He is too in the British system, but in our system, he sets the tone, he sets the style, he sets the manner in which Parliament functions. It's said of Nehru that he devoted a lot of time when Parliament was in session simply sitting there and listening to debates and being present physically. The opposition claims that Mr. Modi is hardly ever present in Parliament over the last 8 years. You have access to the statistics. Is the opposition criticism of Mr. Modi fair?
I think the criticism is applicable to almost all prime ministers across. We use Prime Minister Nehru as an aberration when we come to examples.
I mean, he's unique in that sense.
I wouldn't say unique. I would say that, yes, he was there in Parliament quite a bit, and also because Parliament was sitting for longer. But if you look at successive prime ministers, because of the numbers of portfolio that they've held, or because of the fact that there has been a decline in parliamentary proceedings, even the accusation was also against Prime Minister Singh that,
Manmohan Singh.
Yeah, that he was not present in Parliament as could have been required for a two-term Prime Minister.
Is Mr. Modi present in Parliament even less than Dr. Manmohan Singh was? Has there been a further decline in the attendance of the Prime Minister?
So, if you look at the rules of Parliament, the rules of Parliament say that the Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers don't have to sign the attendance register. But if we look at the fact as to how many times the Parliament, the Prime Minister has intervened in debates, I think it would be a similar number of time that the current Prime Minister
What about actual presence of the Prime Minister on a chair in Parliament?
I think it will be roughly similar to what it was for Prime Minister Manmohan Singh.
Now, there is a British system that ensures accountability and the presence, physical presence of the Prime Minister, which we could consider adopting. I'm talking about the British Convention of Prime Minister's Question Time. And that includes a good 10-12 minute direct exchange between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. It not only ensures that the Prime Minister is made accountable by the opposition in front of the whole of Parliament, but it also gives the leader of the opposition the opportunity to question the most important man in the land. Should we adopt that British Convention of Prime Minister's Question Time? Would it tackle the concern that our Prime Ministers are absent, that they're not intervening, that they're not made accountable, that they're not answering questions? Particularly when you have a Prime Minister like the present one, who hasn't held a single press conference in 8 years.
So, if we look at India, we've had some states which have actually implemented Chief Minister's Question Time. So, Madhya Pradesh, for example, in the early 2000s, used to have a Chief Minister's Question Time that during the Legislative Assembly, one day of the week, the Chief Minister would come to the House and do.
You say used to have they scrapped it?
They have stopped it. Jharkhand is currently an assembly which does have a Chief Minister's Question Time.
And it continues.
And it continues. So I think either Tuesday or Wednesday is reserved as the day as where the Chief Minister comes in and answers.
Should the Jharkhand example, let's not call it the British example any longer, should the Jharkhand example be adopted by the national parliament?
Absolutely. I think if we have to really invigorate question hour, and which is invigorated by the fact that ministers come and respond, I think a unique thing that we could start again in our parliamentary system is to have the Prime Minister come and address the House on a regular fashion.
No, hang on. There's a difference between addressing the House and answering
questioning.
questions.
What I'm suggesting is
because Prime Minister's Question Time is vigorous questioning of the Prime Minister.
Absolutely. So what I'm suggesting is that there should be a Prime Minister's Question Time. It would be a good improvement to our parliamentary system. And in addition to that, a Prime Minister could come and address or set the tone of debate at the beginning of the session about as to what is the agenda.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about the Prime Minister addressing. The Prime Minister does an awful lot of addressing outside Parliament on television. He seems to do it on a daily basis. I'm talking about the Prime Minister being made accountable. You're not made accountable when you address because you're setting the agenda yourself. You're made accountable when you answer questions. You do believe that PMQ, Prime Minister's Question Time, as happens in Britain, should happen in India on a weekly basis.
What I meant was that in addition to just the PMQ,
there should be addresses.
This, yes.
But you know, PMQ works in Britain because you have a speaker who brutally ensures that the Prime Minister doesn't prevaricate, that he answers, right? Will our speaker be capable of, even willing to, similarly brutally enforce discipline on the Prime Minister?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the last three speakers, those are the ones that I've observed. Speaker Somnath Chatterjee, Speaker Meera Kumar, Speaker Sumitra Mahajan, and the current Speaker Om Birla. The speakers have ensured that opposition members of Parliament, when they are questioning ministers, if the minister's reply is not adequate enough, The speakers ensure that the ministers come back to the members with a reply.
John Bercow demanded an apology from Boris Johnson and carried on demanding it till Boris Johnson apologized. That little clip of the House of Commons went viral many times. That ensures that the Prime Minister doesn't get away by prevarication or some form of avoidance. Will our speakers do the same? Because if they don't, PMQ in India will become a waste of time.
I think they will. I'll give you an instance. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2019, the Prime Minister was speaking in Rajya Sabha, and during his speech, he used a word which the Vice President, when he was on the chair, thought that should not go onto the record of the House, and it was then deleted from the record of the House.
So that's very different to what I'm talking about. The Vice President Venkaiah Naidu deleted a word from the Prime Minister's speech without actually pointing out to the Prime Minister during the speech that it was an unparliamentary word. He didn't even go that step far enough. He did it afterwards when the speech was over. I'm talking about a speaker getting up while the Prime Minister is prevaricating and saying, Prime Minister, that is not the answer to the question. You have a duty to answer it. John Bercow does it brutally and ensures as a result that PMQ makes sense. We would have been good enough to say that PMQ should be adopted as a convention in India. I'm pointing out that without a speaker being equally brutal as the British speaker is, it won't work. You're confident our speakers will be tough on the PM?
So I think if they're tough on senior ministers...
No, what about the PM?
I'm
PM
sure
is a different category.
I'm sure, no, actually the PM is not a different category.
Oh, he clearly is a different category. Ministers themselves quail when they see the Prime Minister, but let's not get into that discussion. Will they be tough on the PM?
I don't see a reason as to why not.
Okay. You understand Parliament better than me. I'll accept your word for it. Let's come to that great concern you had about the anti-defection bill, which I deliberately didn't take up earlier because I wanted to take up and spend some time on now. What it's ended up doing is emasculating MPs. MPs, as you know better than me, are meant to be, in fact, representatives of the people with a right to voice their own individual opinions. Instead, they've ended up as slaves of party leadership. Explain to the audience how the Anti-Defection Bill, now Act, has ended up in this rather despairing situation.
So, we are a unique country in our world wherein members of parliament are responsible more to their political parties than to constituents like you and me who voted for them and sent them to parliament. Now, the reason we are in this unique situation is because over the years, political parties realized that not being able to control their members of parliament or their MLAs was resulting in their governments getting destabilized at the states. And one solution that was found, and an easy solution, very often when it comes to parliamentary matters, we have gone for easy solutions. And one easy solution was that you restrict members of parliament so that they cannot speak against the party, either inside or outside the House.
And they can't vote against the party whip's directions.
And they can't vote against the party's whip's directions. Now, maybe if you were generous enough, you could have understood as to if you sign up for a political party's ideology, contest on its ticket, when there is a vote on the floor of the House which will determine the continuance of a government, you would go by the party on whose ticket you were elected. But what I don't understand is as to why should a law control what a member of parliament says outside of parliament, who he sits with, who he goes to meet, where does he stay.
Let me go one step further. And in going that one step further, I'm going to quote you from one of your recent articles where you say the impact and the consequence of the anti-defection law is the following. This law has fundamentally changed the nature of parliament and state legislatures. It's converted MPs who should be free to voice their conscience into men who are slaves to party leadership. They can't criticize their party's position on issues either inside or outside without fear of losing their seat in parliament. Do we need now to perhaps amend the anti-defection law to ensure that it only applies to finance bills and votes of no confidence, where the stability of the government is perhaps at stake. But on all other issues, MPs and MLAs should be free to disagree, dissent and differ from their party leadership.
I wouldn't agree with you. What I would argue is that possibly the time has come to get rid of the anti-defection law altogether.
Completely.
Completely. It hasn't helped any political party save a government in the last 35, 37 years that it has been functioning. It has had an absolutely chilling effect on our legislatures, where people are scared to speak their mind because they're not too sure as to if they're going against their party's stand, would it result in their expulsion from the legislature?
And it's converted party leaders into dictators.
It has converted party leaders into dictators who now don't have to worry about building consensus within the party. They don't have to worry about inner party democracy where they have to discuss things with their MLAs and MPs.
So your solution is scrap it completely.
I have a two-pronged solution.
Quickly, what is it?
The first prong of the solution is scrap it completely. The second prong of the solution is, if you don't want to scrap it completely, then possibly I might agree with you that only limit it to one parliamentary practice, which is when there is a no confidence motion on the floor of the House.
Not even finance bills.
Not even finance.
So literally limit it to just votes of no confidence, where the survival of the government is clearly at stake. But for all other legislation, for all other speeches, MPs and MLAs should be free to voice their conscience. And if they differ, disagree and dissent from their party's position, so be it. They are, after all, individuals with a mind of their own. They're not slaves.
Absolutely. And if the government is trying to pass a piece of legislation, or the finance minister is trying to pass a budget, they would then go to not only their own MPs, they would go to MPs across the political spectrum and convince them as to why their ideas are stronger and why the MPs should vote for them. Currently, that does not need to be done.
Because the anti-defection law means that MPs can't voice what's in their heart and what's in their mind, because they can't be truthful, because they can't speak their conscience, you believe it has fundamentally changed the nature of parliament and state legislatures. It's converted people who should be free men as MPs into slaves of their parties.
If you cannot speak your mind, if you cannot take a position which you fundamentally disagree with the party that you belong to, then if the characterization is slaves, possibly yes, I agree with it.
Let's come at this moment and focus a little on the Rajya Sabha. As you pointed out yourself in one of your articles, it was meant to be a revising chamber where an opportunity would be given yet again to look at, once again, legislation passed by the Lok Sabha. It was also intended as a chamber where specific state concerns could be addressed and expressed. The anti-defection law has ensured that the first function, an opportunity as a revising chamber to look at Lok Sabha legislation again, is completely scuppered. And changes made in legislation in 2003, which broke up the connection between states and the candidature of Rajya Sabha MPs, has effectively ensured that the Rajya Sabha no longer actually expresses and represents the states either. So let me ask you a blunt question. Has the Rajya Sabha ended up losing its raison d'etre?
It's interesting, when we were talking about the anti-defection law, the reason for bringing the anti-defection law was so that there could be stability of governments. Now, and this was a reason that was quoted on the floor of the House when the constitutional amendment was being passed. For some reason, the law was also extended to Rajya Sabha. Now, Rajya Sabha...
And there was no need to do so.
Rajya Sabha does not determine the fate of a popularly elected government. So why would you do that if your intention was not to control members of parliament's voices? The second thing that happened was, when our constitution framers were thinking about Rajya Sabha, they wanted states' voices to be heard. And part of those states' voices was that states would send their representatives, and the election of these representatives was going to be done in such a manner that the ruling party in the state would not be able to send all its representatives. The election was designed in such a way that even opposition parties in the states would be able to do that. In 2003, that connect was already broken, the connect between states and the representatives that it sent. In 2003, that connect was just formally broken, because there were members of parliament who were earlier also elected to Rajya Sabha, but then they'd have to go and find a place and
Dr. Manmohan Singh is a classic example. When he first got elected to Parliament as a Rajya Sabha MP from Assam, he had to go and find a residence, and I think he rented a property from former Chief Minister Saikia, which became Dr. Manmohan Singh's residence in Assam. You had to be a resident of the state that you represented in the Rajya Sabha. That requirement, that residence requirement, has been scrapped.
Yeah.
Now, you can have people who live in Delhi, right? Or are MPs from previously Lok Sabha defeated MPs from Maharashtra, going across and standing in Haryana or Madhya Pradesh and getting elected to the Rajya Sabha from there. That state connect in terms of the residence requirement has gone.
Yeah. So, Kuldeep Nair, he used to be a nominated member of parliament when this law was being passed. He actually challenged the passage of this law in the Supreme Court on these very similar lines, that the state connect is getting broken. Fali Nariman was a nominated member of parliament at that time, and he argued on similar lines. But there was another change in 2003, and that other change that cemented the hand of political parties in the election of Rajya Sabha members was this, that after 2003, Rajya Sabha elections became open ballot elections.
Quite right. You're required to show how you voted to your party leadership.
Yeah. So now, let's tie all of this together. Let's tie the anti-defection together. Let's tie the 2003 amendment together. So now, if you were an MLA and you had to show your vote to your party leadership, you are now doubly scared, right? Even though there's no whip, but you know that there's going to be consequences, because you are showing if you are not agreeing to the choice of a candidate who does not belong from your state. The anti-defection law again, imposes a certain amount of pressure on you as to stand by the party, even if your constituents tell you that what the party is doing is not right, and ultimately you're responsible to them. So these things have ensured that fundamental relationship of a member of parliament in parliament as the public's representative has altered. Now they're fully the political party's representative.
On what I keep calling the free man scale, it seems that Rajya Sabha MPs are less free men than even Lok Sabha MPs, because Rajya Sabha MPs, when they vote for a Rajya Sabha election, actually have to show to their leadership how they voted.
Yeah, so MLAs,
something that should be strictly private and personal has to be now made a display to your party leadership.
Yeah, so that's MLAs and state legislative assemblies who vote. So I would say that Rajya Sabha MPs are unnecessarily burdened by the anti-defection law when there was no need to do them. MLAs, on the other hand, are doubly burdened, because not only do they have the anti-defection law, they also have to show their votes when they're voting for a Rajya Sabha.
Absolutely. There is a view that as a result of the way Parliament has developed, and all the different things that we've talked about fall into that over the last 75 years, party leaderships have been strengthened at the cost of MPs and MLAs, and political parties have been strengthened at the cost of legislatures. Would you agree with that view?
Yeah. But let me go ahead and, substantiate as to why I'm saying that I agree with the fact that political parties have benefited at the cost of legislatures. If you look at the responsibility cast on members of parliament, it is far greater than on a political party. There's a responsibility on them on the anti-defection law, that they can't disagree with their political party. But the political parties that...
I'm not sure responsibility is the right word, it's more imposition on them.
So, imposition. But assuming for the sake of argument that there was a mutual responsibility between a political party and its members, a political party can go ahead and change its stance without consulting its members, without any penalty, right, so to say. So, for example, if you joined a political party based on a certain ideology and your ideology matched with the political party, that political party went ahead and betrayed your trust. You don't have a solution, but if you do it, you can be expelled. So that's one thing that happened.
All right. You no longer have the right and privilege to disagree on a fundamental issue of conscience with your party without running the cost of losing your seat.
Yeah. Second, the cost is only to you. The cost is never to a political
Does
party.
any other country, any other parliamentary democracy have an anti-defection law with the consequences that we've discussed that apply in India?
I think there are 6, and
But with the same consequences?
the same consequences, but those 6 are so small and not the kind of parliamentary democracies that we would like to compare ourselves to.
Well, we are proud that we are the world's largest democracy. Whether we function democratically after elections are over is a completely different matter. I'll simply alert the audience to that. I won't go into it. But for us to have an anti-defection law that ends up, in quotes, enslaving MLAs and MPs means that we're actually making a mockery of our claim of being the world's largest democracy. World's largest democracy, yes, but the poor MPs can't act democratically in terms of either responding to their constituency or their conscience if their party leadership says, no, you won't do that.
So possibly in our constitution, one of the most abhorrent aspects of the constitution is the anti-defection law.
Absolutely.
Because what is doing is that you and I can speak our minds,
But MPs can't.
but our MPs can't.
Which is why your first preference is scrap it altogether.
For an additional reason,
Which is?
which is that it has, one, it obviously has the effect that it has had, but it also has a damaging effect beyond members of parliament. To give you an example, anti-defection petitions have to be decided by the speaker. Now, if there is going to be consequence on the continuance of a government,
The speaker won't act, and we've seen that happen, and we've also seen how people get around the anti-defection law by resigning and then joining a new government and becoming a minister almost immediately, with the fact that they, on the privilege that they could fight for an election 6 months later. All of that has happened, and that's another good reason why this law must be scrapped.
so yes, so if a law wasn't working, that was bad enough. But if law is not only not working, but also has a damaging effect on other offices and institutions,
All the more reason to scrap it.
all the more reason.
Let me end by asking you what perhaps is an unusual and maybe awkward question. But as you look at the way our parliament has functioned and the trajectory over the last 75 years, has the quality, talent and skill of our MPs improved, or has it regressed?
I think the talent has definitely improved. We have many more articulate members of parliament who are not only well versed with parliamentary procedure but are able to put their points across. I think what has regressed is the fact that we as a country have started taking our parliament very lightly, so to say. We have reduced our members of parliament not as lawmakers but are individual problem solvers. So now members of parliament are more worried about not shaping better laws, not deliberating on the floor of the House, but ensuring if they can solve their constituents' problems on a day-to-day basis.
Let me come back and put this to you. In the late 40s, 50s and 60s, the Indian parliament was very highly thought of by the Indian people. We respected our politicians, we admired many of them, and they held extremely diligent, detailed debates. Some of those debates were in fact fascinating to listen to because of the mastery of the subject that MPs and ministers or the opposition showed. Today, 75 years later, that respect for parliament has ceased to exist. That respect for politicians has ceased to exist. And if you were to read Hansard, or the Indian equivalent of Hansard, the debates are nowhere near as detailed or fascinating or as well informed. So I come back to my question, and I'll rephrase it this time. Is Parliament today functioning as well as we thought it was functioning in the 50s and 60s?
So again, a slightly longer answer.
Not too long, because we're running out of time.
Yes. Has the quality of debate in Parliament better, equivalent than what used to happen earlier? Comparing apples to oranges, I think debate in Parliament is still of a higher quality.
Why are you saying apples to oranges? You're comparing apples to apples. You're comparing debate in the 50s with debate today. Is the debate today better or is it worse?
The debate is better because
The debate today is better than the debate in Parliament in the 50s and 60s.
yes, because what we are doing is that when we compare the debate in the 50s and 60s, we compare the cream of the top with the worst of the present. Now, if you look at the average debate in Parliament, which very often goes unreported, there are some really nuanced debates that happen in Parliament.
Let me ask you a different question. What about the competence of the cabinet and ministers? And let's also add to that the competence of the top members of the opposition. Was it better in the 50s and 60s than it is today?
I wish there was an empirical mechanism of
I'm talking about your impression.
Unfortunately, I don't have those impressions. But what I can say is this. As an institution, Parliament has a number of infirmities that need strengthening. In terms of the support that members of Parliament have, in terms of the quality of members of Parliament, in terms of procedure that is there.
The quality of members of Parliament has gone down?
What I meant by the quality of members of Parliament is the political parties, the individuals that they select to send to Parliament.
That is the quality of members of Parliament?
Yeah.
You're just phrasing it differently.
Yes.
Has that gone down?
Well, data from ADR seems to suggest that a number of members of Parliament who are now elected to Parliament have records, have criminal records. So it's a question that we need to ask as to...
Side by side, they also seem to end up being crore-patis as well.
Well, if you can blame that to individuals like you and me who have...
We elect them, therefore we are to blame.
No, not that. I wish it was that simple, but not because of that. I think somewhere down the line we have ensured that the public discourse is such that members who get elected are not very often members who would want to come to that profession. So, for example, would I want to go into politics? Bad pay.
Now, hang on a second. Members who get elected are very often not members who want to come into that profession. Why do they stand for election? It's not compulsory to stand for election. I mean, if you stand for election, you want that profession. Otherwise, you won't stand for it. So I can't quite understand the point you're making.
Yeah. Maybe I was circular in my logic. What I was trying to say was that if we take the pool of talented people in the country, and in that pool of talented people, many people would not want to enter politics because of the limitation that political life imposes.
Because politics is looked upon as a deplorable profession by most Indians. Most Indians believe that politicians are crooks, believe that they are corrupt, believe that they don't do their work, believe that they don't put national interest ahead. That is the impression Indians have of politicians. You can't deny that.
That might be the impression, but when I look at members of Parliament, I also see individuals who are conscientious, who...
Are they a minority or is it the majority?
I think anybody who takes the job of a member of Parliament or an...
No, you're not answering my question. Are the minority conscientious or is the majority conscientious?
I think the majority is conscientious.
Okay. So you do believe, despite all the problems we've discussed about the functioning of Parliament, that the quality of Parliament's functioning today is better than the quality was in the 50s?
The quality of members of Parliament is definitely better.
And the quality of the functioning of Parliament?
The quality of the functioning of Parliament could definitely use improvements.
Is it better than the 50s?
I think so. The amount of technicality...
So both in terms of the quality of the MPs and the quality of the functioning of Parliament, Parliament's functioning in terms of individuals but also as an institution is better than it was in the 50s?
Yes, it is better. Is it at a level that we would want to be, 70 years?
Clearly not.
Clearly not.
Clearly not. That we've discussed.
Yes.
But there is an improvement compared to the 50s. It's
Yes.
not a regression.
Yes.
We're agreed on that.
Yes.
Chakshu Roy, thank you very much for this comprehensive tour de force that actually explains Parliament in a way that I don't think anyone ever has before. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, And if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.